A man was standing in my driveway at 7 in the morning, and I almost didn't stop my car in time. I saw him in the rearview mirror first. An old man, maybe 80, in a long grey coat, standing completely still in the cold, not waving, not moving, just standing there like he'd been waiting for a long time and had gotten used to it. I put the car in park and got out slowly, because something about the way he held himself made me think he might fall. He looked at me, and his chin started to tremble. "Are you Martin?" he asked. "Martin Ashworth." I said yes. I told him my full name was Martin Gerald Ashworth, and I watched his face do something I'd never seen on a stranger before. He pressed his hand over his mouth and turned away from me for a moment, like he needed a second to collect himself. His shoulders shook once. I thought he was having some kind of episode. I asked him if he needed me to call someone. He shook his head and turned back around, and his eyes were wet. "I've been looking for you for a very long time," he said. That was the morning everything changed, though I didn't know it yet. And I should tell you, I wasn't in a good place when that man showed up in my driveway. I hadn't been in a good place for about 2 years. My wife passed in the spring of 2022. 41 years we were married. She was the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday, who kept a spare key under the geranium pot for the neighbor's teenage son because she knew he sometimes locked himself out, who made a proper Sunday roast every single week, whether there was company or not. Her name was June, and when she was gone, I didn't quite know what to do with myself, or with the house, or with any of it. We had 2 sons and a daughter. After the funeral, things moved very fast in a direction I wasn't expecting. My older son, he's a real estate agent in Mississauga, started talking about the house within the first month. He came over one Sunday with his wife, and I made coffee, and he sat at the kitchen table where his mother used to sit, and he started talking about what made financial sense. He said property values in our area of Hamilton had gone up significantly. He said a man my age shouldn't be rattling around in a 4-bedroom house alone. He said it would be good for me to downsize somewhere with less maintenance. I was 63 years old. I was not rattling around anywhere. I had just buried my wife. My younger son said roughly the same things 2 weeks later, only he framed it as concern for my health. He said the driveway was long and icy in winter, and what would happen if I fell. He said he'd looked into some very nice retirement communities near Guelph. I want to be careful how I talk about my children, because I know this reflects on June too, and she raised them well. But I also want to be honest, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story worth telling. They wanted the house. That's what it came down to. June and I had bought it in 1987 for just under $200,000, and it was worth over $1 million now, and they wanted their share of it before I was ready to give it. My daughter was different. She called me every few days just to talk. She drove up from Burlington on weekends sometimes, and we'd sit on the back porch and drink tea, and she didn't mention the house once. She just sat with me. By the fall of that year, things with my sons had gotten bad enough that I stopped answering certain calls. There were voicemails I didn't listen to. There was a letter from a lawyer. My own son had hired a lawyer to explore whether the estate had been properly administered. I had to hire my own lawyer to respond to it. That cost me $4,000 I hadn't planned to spend. I started driving for a rideshare service in January, not because I had to. My pension from CN Rail was enough to live on, but because the house was too quiet and I needed somewhere to go in the mornings. I'd been a locomotive engineer for 32 years. I was used to having a purpose, a schedule, somewhere I had to be. Sitting in the kitchen with my coffee, and the silence was making me feel like I was disappearing. So I drove. Early mornings mostly. Airport runs, hospital drop-offs, the occasional university student who'd missed the last bus. I didn't mind the work. People in cars at 6 in the morning are usually quiet and polite and grateful. Some of them were interesting. I drove a woman once, who was a marine biologist, on her way to catch a flight to Halifax for a research project. I drove a retired schoolteacher who told me he taught in the same classroom in Dundas for 31 years and still dreamed about it. I liked those mornings. It was the afternoons I couldn't manage yet. Then, in February, 8 months after June's funeral, I came home from a morning shift and found my younger son and his wife in my kitchen. They had a key. All 3 of my children did, and they'd let themselves in. There were papers on the kitchen table. My son had a pen in his hand. He said they'd found a retirement property near Guelph that had an opening. He said he'd already spoken to the admissions coordinator. He said it would be good for me. I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen and looked at the papers on my wife's table, and I felt something go very cold and very clear inside me. I told them to leave. My son said he was just trying to help. I told him again, leave. There was a scene. His wife said things. He said things. I stood by the door until they walked through it, and then I sat down at the kitchen table alone, and I looked at the February light coming through the window over the sink. The window June had always kept a little African violet on the sill, and I thought, this is what it's come to. I didn't tell my daughter what happened. I didn't want to put her in the middle of it. I just kept driving. The old man's name was Clifford Beaumont. He was 81 years old, and he had driven himself from his home in London, Ontario, about 2 hours west, specifically to find me. He had gotten my address from the city directory, he said. The old kind, the kind people don't use anymore. He'd been trying to track me down for several months through other means first, but he'd run into dead ends, and finally he'd simply driven to Hamilton and knocked on the door of the address he had. I invited him in. I made tea. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table, and he took off his coat carefully and folded it over the back of the chair, and he looked around the kitchen like a man who was preparing himself to say something that had been waiting a very long time. He asked me about my father. My father's name had been Gerald Ashworth. He'd been a mechanic, spent most of his working life at a garage on Barton Street. He died when I was 44, so it's been almost 20 years. He was a quiet man, not cold. He was warm, actually, easy to be around, but he didn't talk much about himself. He was the kind of man who fixed things and showed up and didn't make a production of either. I told Clifford this. I said my father had been a mechanic, not particularly remarkable in the ways the world measures things. Good man, though. Steady. Clifford nodded slowly, and something in his expression shifted. In 1971, he said, I was 28 years old, and I was about to lose everything. He'd grown up in Windsor and moved to London in his mid-20s to try to start a small manufacturing business, industrial fasteners, the kind used in automotive assembly. He had a partner, a lease on a small workshop, and about $12,000 in savings, which was everything he'd been able to put together. In 1971, $12,000 was a significant sum. Enough to get started, barely. His partner pulled out in the summer of that year. Personal reasons, a family illness, nothing malicious, but the timing was disastrous. Clifford was suddenly carrying the entire operation alone, and one of his primary clients had moved up a payment deadline. He needed $9,000 within 6 weeks, or he would lose the workshop lease and default on a materials order that would follow him as a debt for years. He didn't have it. He'd been to 2 banks. Both had said no. He was 28, with no credit history worth mentioning, no collateral, and a business that was barely a year old. He drove to Hamilton that August on an unrelated errand. He had a cousin here, something to do with helping him move, and ended up at a small garage on Barton Street because his car was making a sound he didn't like. It was a Saturday afternoon. Most garages were closed. My father's garage wasn't. He said my father looked at the car, found a loose heat shield, fixed it in 20 minutes, and didn't charge him for it. He said it was a small thing, but it was a hot day and Clifford was tired and stressed, and he ended up sitting on a bench outside the garage for a while instead of leaving right away, and somehow, the way those things happen, they started talking. He told my father what was going on. He didn't mean to go into the full story, he said, but my father had a way of listening. He asked questions, not intrusive ones, just the kind that let you know someone was actually paying attention. By the time Clifford left the garage that afternoon, my father had agreed to lend him $8,000. I put my tea down. $8,000 in 1971. I looked it up later that evening after Clifford left, is equivalent to roughly $65,000 today. For a mechanic with a wife and a young son, that was not a casual sum. That was, I would have thought, almost everything my father could have had saved. Clifford said my father had an account he'd been putting money into since he was 19. He'd been saving to buy the garage building outright one day, rather than lease it. He said my father sat with him in the garage office for about an hour, going through the numbers, and then wrote a check and told him to pay it back when he was able, and not to worry about interest. He said my father told him, I believe you're going to make this work. Clifford did make it work. He got through that autumn and the following year, and by 1974, his business had 3 full-time employees. By 1979, he'd moved to a larger facility. By the time he retired in 2010, Beaumont Industrial Supply had 47 employees and an annual revenue. I won't repeat because it's not my number to share, but let's say it was substantial. He tried to repay my father within a year of the original loan. My father had moved. Clifford tracked down the new address and sent a letter. No response. He sent another. He tried to call. This was the early 70s. Finding a number wasn't simple, and the number he had was no longer in service. He hired someone, he said, a kind of informal finder, to locate a Gerald Ashworth, mechanic, formerly of Barton Street, Hamilton. The man came back with 3 possibilities, none of which proved correct. He tried again in the 80s. He tried again after he retired. Each time he ran into the problem of my father's name. Gerald Ashworth is not an unusual name in Ontario, and the lack of any digital trail. My father had never had a credit card, never owned property in his own name, had rented until the end of his life. When my father died, I handled his estate. There wasn't much. His tools. Some furniture. A small savings account with just over $4,000 in it. I remember thinking, at the time, that it seemed like very little for a man who'd worked so hard for so long. I didn't understand it then. I think I was beginning to understand it now. He never mentioned it, I said. Not once. Clifford looked at me steadily. No, he said, I didn't think he would have. He had, over the years, set aside the amount he'd intended to repay, not the original $8,000. That seemed wrong to him, too small, too literal. He'd thought about what that money had meant in context. He'd thought about the interest, about what the money might have earned if my father had invested it, about what it had cost my father not to have it during those years. He had settled on an amount. He had a document with him prepared by his lawyer. He slid it across the table. I'm not going to write the number here, not in full. I will say it was more than I had expected, more than I think most people would have expected. It was the kind of number that made the kitchen very quiet. I looked at the paper for a long time. I thought about my father on a hot August Saturday, listening to a stranger in his garage. I thought about him writing a check and saying, I believe you're going to make this work. I thought about the small savings account with $4,000 in it. I thought about all the Saturdays he worked, and all the years he rented, and the way he'd go quiet sometimes when money came up, like there was a thought he wasn't going to chase. I asked Clifford why he hadn't just kept it. He'd tried to repay it. He'd tried for 50 years. Plenty of people would have said they'd done enough. He shook his head. It wasn't mine to keep, he said. I always knew that. I looked at him across the table. This 81-year-old man who'd driven 2 hours in a February morning, who'd spent 50 years trying to return something that most people would have forgotten. And I thought about what my father had seen in him that Saturday afternoon, what he'd recognized. Maybe my father had simply been good at reading people. Maybe that was its own kind of intelligence. I signed the document. My sons found out eventually. I didn't tell them, my daughter did, not out of any intention to cause conflict, but because she thought they deserved to know the full story of their grandfather. She was right. They did deserve to know it. My older son called me within an hour. He was very warm on the phone, warmer than he'd been in 2 years. He said it was an incredible story. He said our grandfather must have been an amazing man. He said, and here he paused in a way that had a kind of shake to it, a kind of preparation, that he hoped I would take some time to think carefully about how to manage this, that there were estate planning considerations, that it might make sense to talk to a financial advisor together as a family. I let him finish. Then I told him I had already spoken to my own financial advisor and my own lawyer, and that I had a plan. The plan did not involve them. I want to say that clearly, not out of bitterness, because I have been trying very hard not to carry bitterness. But I had watched my sons sit at my wife's table and talk about what made financial sense while I was still learning how to sleep alone. I had spent $4,000 defending my own estate from my own child. I had watched my daughter drive up from Burlington on weekends and sit with me and ask for nothing and give me what I actually needed, which was just her presence. Those things meant something. They told me something about who people are when it matters. I set aside a meaningful amount for my daughter. That's between me and her. The rest, the larger portion, I put into a foundation. I'd been thinking about it since the night Clifford left. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after he drove away, and I thought about what it meant that my father had given away most of his savings at 35 years old and never mentioned it to anyone. I thought about what kind of value system produces a man like that, and whether that value system had anywhere to go now. The foundation is called the Gerald Ashworth Fund. It's administered through a community foundation based in Hamilton, and its specific purpose is to support older adults in financial hardship. People over 65 who are facing housing instability, who can't afford medication, who are one bad month away from a crisis. The kind of situation my father might have helped one person out of, quietly, with no expectation of return. I don't run it. I gave the money and helped set the direction, and I have a seat on the advisory committee, but the day-to-day work is done by people who know how to do it. I just wanted to make sure the thing existed. My daughter cried when I told her. She said it was exactly what her grandmother would have wanted. I think she was right about that. June would have approved. June would have approved. June would have, in fact, suggested something like it herself, and been a little impatient with me for taking so long to think of it. I still drive some mornings, not as many. I scaled back after the foundation got established because there were meetings to attend and documents to review, and it turned out that doing something real with a sum of money requires a significant amount of your attention. But I still go out a few times a week. I like the early light. I like the way Hamilton looks at 6 in the morning when the streets are quiet and the lake is grey, and everything feels like it hasn't started yet. I picked up a fare last month, an older man, maybe 70, on his way to St. Joseph's for an appointment. We drove in companionable silence for a while, and then he asked me, the way passengers sometimes do, whether I'd had an interesting life. I thought about that for a moment. I told him I thought I probably had, though I hadn't always known it while it was happening. I told him my father had been a mechanic who gave away most of his savings to a stranger and never told a soul, and that the stranger had spent 50 years trying to pay it back, and that in the end it had found its way to people who needed it. The man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father sounds like he was something." I said he was. He really was. I just wish I'd known enough when he was alive to tell him so. I keep thinking about the fact that my father never said a word. Not to me, not to my mother, not to anyone as far as I can tell. He lent a young stranger nearly everything he had saved, and then he just went back to work. He kept showing up at the garage on Barton Street, kept fixing cars, kept renting instead of owning, and he never once seemed to feel that he was owed an explanation for how his life had turned out. I used to think that was just his personality, that quiet, steady way he had. Now I think it was something more deliberate than that. I think he understood something about how a person is supposed to move through the world that I'm only beginning to grasp in my 60s. What Clifford did, driving 2 hours on a February morning, spending 50 years trying to return something most people would have rationalized, keeping, that wasn't just decency, it was a kind of intelligence. He understood that a debt doesn't disappear because it becomes inconvenient to repay. He understood that the discomfort of owing something, of carrying an unresolved obligation, is actually useful information. It tells you something true about who you are and what you value. He could have let it go. He had every practical reason to. Instead, he let it sit with him, unresolved, for 5 decades, because he knew the resolution mattered more than the ease of forgetting. I've been thinking about that kind of persistence. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that announces itself, but the quiet, long kind. My father had it too. He didn't give that money away on an impulse and then regret it quietly for years. He made a decision about what kind of man he was going to be, and then he just kept being that man, one ordinary day at a time without needing anyone to acknowledge it. That takes something. It takes a clearer sense of yourself than most of us manage. And then there's what I had to do. I had to look at my sons, my own children, who I'd known their whole lives, and understand that love doesn't automatically produce good character. That hurt in a way I wasn't prepared for, but I think refusing to pretend otherwise was the right thing, not out of punishment, not out of anger, though there was some of that too, but because the choices we make about who gets what, who we stand beside, who we protect, those choices are a record of what we actually believe. My daughter drove up from Burlington and sat with me and asked for nothing. That meant everything. It deserved to mean everything. I'm 64 now. I have less time ahead of me than behind me, and I find I care less about what's comfortable and more about what's true. The foundation carries my father's name. When I think about that, I don't feel pride exactly. It's something quieter than pride. It feels like a conversation I'm still having with a man who died 20 years ago, like I'm finally understanding what he was trying to show me, just by how he lived. He believed Clifford was going to make it work. He was right. And somewhere in that, I think, is everything worth knowing.